called via mention, but it's actually about interpersonal relationships. Okay. So I'll be quite brief. Continuing with verbal oppression. So there are 3 examples here. Indirectly humiliating someone, and it says in this instance, the purpose of the speech is to degrade another human being under the pretext that he has his best interest at heart. For example, a person for no apparent reason says to a repentant or a Baal Shuvah, I thank Hashem for giving you the wisdom to repent, while pretending to care about the other. The real purpose is to belittle him by reminding him of his past. This category also includes humiliating someone by asking him a question when it is clear that the person being asked cannot answer the question. Second example, one who justifies another's suffering. This includes false comfort offered to someone who is suffering greatly, such as grieving at the loss of a loved one, or through a severe disease, by telling the sufferer that his pain is a consequence of his sins. Such statements, disguised as pious platitudes, may reflect a desire to hurt and shame. And then the third example, one who leads his friend astray under the guise of helping him. This category includes giving a stranger wrong directions or directing someone to buy an item at a store that doesn't carry such an item. Shulchan Aruch includes this category, going into a store and giving the shopkeeper the false impression that one is seriously considering making a purchase with no real intention of doing so. Then it says the Maharal explains that one who is disgraced through verbal abuse is viewed by the abuser as nothing. And this is in Chudishay Agadas and Bava Kamma. Underlying verbal abuse and fraud is absolute contempt for the other person and a complete lack of consideration for the pain and shame caused by the words. And lastly, the Sefer Chinuch adds that the prohibition does not lie in the intention, but in the result of the verbal abuse. He explains that it is forbidden to say anything unhelpful that can cause another human being pain and distress.
Gavin, it's good for you to show up. Why don't you read?
I need whatever I can get. Thank you.
So do we all.
We all do. I agree. Mishnah. If the fact that one stole an ox or a sheep was established by the testimony of 2 witnesses, and the fact that he then slaughtered or sold the stolen animal was established by the testimony of 1 witness or by his own admission, he pays the 2-fold payment. But he does not pay the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. If one stole an ox or a sheep and then slaughtered it on the Sabbath, or if one stole an ox or sheep and then slaughtered it for idolatry, or if one stole an ox or sheep for his father and his father died, and afterwards he slaughtered or sold it, or if one stole an ox or a sheep and he consecrated it and afterwards he slaughtered or sold it, in all these cases he pays the 2-fold payment, but he's not paid the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. Rabbi Shimon says, with respect to a consecrated animal for which he bears responsibility, that he pays the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. With respect to a consecrated animal for which he does not bear responsibility, he is exempt.
Excellently read, mate. Excellently read, Gavin. Now, just something to bring to your guys' attention is that first part. If the fact that one stole an ox or sheep was established by the testimony of 2 witnesses, and the fact that he then slaughtered or sold the stolen animal was established by the testimony of 1 witness, or by his own admission, he pays a 2-fold payment, but he does not pay the 4-5-fold payment. So if you want to know why he doesn't pay the 4-5-fold payment, although generally one who admits to a monetary liability is liable to pay, the additional payment for selling or slaughtering the stolen animal is a kanas. It's a fine. And one who admits to a fine is not liable to pay it. That's Rashi's explanation. Now, the Gemara is obviously going to note that the Mishnah's ruling with respect to not paying the 4 or 5-fold payment on the basis of a lone witness appears obvious. Guys, we've often said you need 2 witnesses to incriminate somebody. So even 1 witness doesn't make anybody liable to pay a regular monetary obligation. So the cases are contrasting to the cases that we've done in previous Mishnayot. Why? Because, guys, if you remember, we on the 74th daf, when we learned in the 70a, that there were two witnesses, and they testified to the theft, and two witnesses testified to the slaughter or sale, the thief pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. Our Mishnah now talks about a case where there were two witnesses to the theft, but there's only one witness, or the thief's confession, which is its own only one witness to the slaughter or sale. So the thief pays only the twofold payment, of which there are two witnesses, but not the fourfold or fivefold payment. Further to which, guys, if you have a look, it discusses if one stole an ox or a sheep and then slaughtered it on the Sabbath, okay? Or if one stole an ox or a sheep and then slaughtered it for idolatry. The cases there as well were covered in the 70th daf, and that we learned that one who steals an ox or a sheep and then sells it on Shabbat or slaughters it on Yom Kippur is liable to the four or fivefold payment. I don't know if you remember, we were shocked. We thought that if you slaughter an animal on Yom Kippur, that one is eligible to the death penalty. But no, you're not. There's a four or fivefold payment, and there was a discussion also of lashes, of what happened. And as far as selling it on Shabbat, you're still liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment because you're liable for kares, but it's not technically a death penalty offense to sell it on the Sabbath. Now, our Mishnah here is completely in contrast to that. It's saying, okay, what happens if we have a case of one who steals an animal and then slaughters it on Shabbat? Obviously exempted from the four or fivefold payment, guys. Why? Guys? Why?
You get the higher penalty. They'll get a higher penalty.
Which is what, Gavin? That's excellent.
Well, we thought it was the death penalty, but I think it's not.
It is. For slaughtering an animal on Shabbat.
Well, that's the only thing that can be higher is the death penalty. Yeah.
Correct, because what we learned in our Mishnah in the 70th daf was that you sold an animal on Shabbos. That's not a capital offense. But to slaughter an animal on Shabbat is a capital offense. That's kimle b'di rabba minay, which means the lower penalty is waived for the higher one. And that's why there's exemption from the monetary liability, because it's incurred while committing a capital offense. And it's the same on as far as, so that's pretty clear. And then if you sell the stolen animal for idol worship, you're liable to the four or fivefold payment. Don't get me wrong, guys, it's not a good idea. And there's obviously penalties that are involved as far as that's concerned, which we learned. But this is a completely different case. If you must know that idol worship is part of a slaughtering process, and that gains the death penalty immediately. So obviously here, exactly as Gavin said, for slaughtering for idol worship, it exempts the four or fivefold payment because it's a capital offense. And it's waived the financial liability if it's the same act while committing a capital offense. Excellent, Gavin. So, if you have a look and we go a little bit further, or if one stole an ox or a sheep and he consecrated it and afterwards he slaughtered or sold it, in all those cases he pays the twofold payment, but he does not pay the four or fivefold payment. So, obviously, if we learned the Mishnah in 78, everything here is a contrast to that. If you stole an ox or sheep from a person, let's not say you guys are tzaddikim, but let's say a Rosh steals an ox or sheep from his father and slaughtered or sold it before his father died, obviously he's liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment, because in this case, it's talking about selling or slaughtering an animal after the father died. And the reason why there's an exemption from a four or fivefold payment is since the son inherited a share of the stolen animal upon his father's death, there's no penalty because it's not completely unlawful. He does have a share in it. He's obviously going to give his brothers their share, but there's not four or fivefold payment because it's his animal he's slaughtering or selling. He just has to give the brothers their share. Does that make sense? So this case is directly in contrast to that. And then further to it, the Mishnah in 78 taught that a thief who slaughtered a stolen animal and then consecrated it is liable to a four or fivefold payment. Okay, because he stole it from a private individual. Now, our Mishnah talks about a case that he first consecrated it and then slaughtered or sold it. He's exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment Because if you slaughter an animal that belongs to Hegdesh, the temple, it's not like he stole from his fellow, in inverted commas, at which you have to pay penalties. So it's a different case, as Rashi said. So since you can only consecrate something that you own, the Mishnah is referring to a case where the thief consecrated the animal after the original owner had despaired of retrieving it. So if you look at the 66 stuff, guys, is that you had that concept of Yeush, which was despair. So when the thief consecrates it, Hekdesh acquires it through Yeush, which is despair. So he waited a reasonable amount of time where the original owner gave it up. And it also has to be bound with Shinoi Rishus. So the word Shinoi, if you do an act on a Shabbos that's generally prohibited, like you have to move a muksa article, you have to do it with a Shinoi, a difference, a change. So Shinoi Rishus, like Rishus Harabim or whatever, a Rishus is a domain, it's a change of domain. So according to the one opinion, you have to have despair with a change of domain. So the despair of the original owner and a change of domain to the temple-based area. That, effected by the consecration, obviously exempts the fourfold payment. Okay? Now, if the thief hadn't consecrated the animal, he wouldn't have acquired it through despair alone. That's according to the one opinion, there is despair alone, Yush, and according to the other opinion, it's not, right? So if you wouldn't have, if the thief hadn't consecrated the animal, he would not have acquired it through despair alone, and wouldn't have been liable. Sorry, in that case, he would have been liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment for a slaughter or sale. So if you look at Rav Yochanan said that it's not enough just to have despair. You have to have a change of domain. So that was the case where you had somebody that stole it and then sold it, so that the buyer changed domain as well as despair. Do you remember that? That was Rav Yochanan. Now, Reish Lakish says, no, a thief acquires a stolen animal through despair alone. That was the argument with Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So the Mishnah cannot refer to where the owner despaired. So, because if the owner despaired, then the thief had acquired the animal and is exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment, even if he doesn't consecrate it. So rather, according to Reish Lakish, our Mishnah must refer to where the owner consecrated the animal and then while it was being held by the thief. So you're saying, what the heck are we talking about? So you remember Rav Dosia? Remember there was a case where you had ears of grain, and there was the corner field for the poor, Kevin, that they were only allowed to take 2 ears of grain. Anything more than 2 ears, they had to leave it. But they didn't know that. So sometimes they took 3 ears. So the owner of the field had to basically forgive them of it in advance, because he didn't want them to be responsible for not separating truma properly or having stolen it because of the ignorance. So in that case, he said, there was a whole case, do you have retroactive clarification? In other words, could you basically before the fact say, listen, whatever you're going to steal, we forgive you of it or whatever, and you don't have any idea of how much was stolen. Okay, so that was one view. And the other view is after it's stolen, you can say, right, we've worked out what's stolen, we forgive you of it. But then there was that argument, if it's not in your control, can you actually release something? Because you don't possess it, you can't use it. How can you give up control of it when you have already lost control of it? Remember that whole argument. So we're not going to go all the way back there, but I'm saying this whole Mishnah is directly in contrast with that. So, and then just the last part to bear in mind is Rav Shimon says, with respect to a consecrated animal for which he bears responsibility, obviously for which the thief bears responsibility, that it said, it's hereby incumbent upon me to bring an offering, and then Ghazi designates the specific animal as an offering. In that case, as you know, if the animal dies or stolen, even through no fault of his own, he's liable to designate and bring another animal as an offering instead. So if you designate an animal, a consecrated animal, you bear responsibility. But if you don't designate it, you basically exempt. So you've got to basically have a general obligation that you're going to bring an offering, but you don't specify the animal because that's going to get you into trouble. All right. That's fairly, very straightforward, Gavin. Well learned. But you remember that issue with Rav Dorsia, and can you give up something that you don't already own? Well, that you're not in possession of, not that you don't own. You mind, because there are two factors that make it yours, Kevin. The one is, well, do you have control over it? And the other one is, did you buy it? And if there are opinions that say if you don't have both factors, how can you give away something that's not in your control? And another factor that says, well, you can technically, in order to forgive somebody of theft. And it even said, what if somebody broke in your place and took that something that wasn't yet redeemed? Can you redeem it with coins? And how can you redeem it with coins if they already stole it from you? Remember that whole issue. So the 70th daf is in contrasting cases with this one. Exactly in contrasting cases in the Aleph part. All right, let's hit the Gemara without any further ado. So, the Gemara addresses the Mishnah's first ruling that where only one witness testified to the slaughter or sale, the thief is exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the Gemara asks, if the fact that he slaughtered or sold the stolen animal was established by the testimony of only one witness, then it's obvious that he's not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. Why does the Mishnah find it necessary to teach us the obvious? In other words, it's understandable why the Mishnah must state that the thief is exempt when he confesses to the slaughter. Because, guys, in general, one's confession to a monetary liability makes him liable to pay. Okay? Now, you might say, but we thought you don't have to pay if you confess to a monetary liability. So you've got to define the difference between a knas, a penalty, and a mammon, which is compensation. That's number one. Number two, you've got to also define the different opinion. There's one that says if you admit to a fine, you don't have to pay anything. And there's another opinion that says if you admit to a fine, you don't have to pay the twofold penalty because the fine is on the paying double part. If he stole, he shall pay double when you trouble the court, but you still have to pay the principal. And there are those that say you don't have to pay anything. Okay, so that's we understand that as far as a single witness is concerned, but we're going to get into this issue of self-incrimination. So the Gemara said, this is what the Mishnah is teaching us. Establishing the slaughter or sale of the stolen animal by his own admission is comparable to establishing the testimony of one witness. In other words, the Mishnah does not mention the case of one witness to teach us that one witness doesn't render the thief liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment, because it's obvious. It states the law of one witness to compare it to the law stated with it. And what law followed it in the Mishnah? That the thief's confession is to teach us that the law is the same in both cases. In other words, if you looked at the flow of the Mishnah, it says the exemption brought about by one's own confession extends only as far as the exemption brought about by a single witness. So what do we mean? Is we're saying establishing the slaughter or sale of the stolen animal by his own admission is comparable to establishing it by the testimony of one witness, just as in the case where the slaughter or sale is established by one witness. When another witness subsequently comes and joins him, the thief becomes liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. So what it's saying is, look, if one of two witnesses to the incident has testified by himself, it doesn't compromise, listen carefully guys, it doesn't compromise the future effectiveness of their testimony. Because the law, of course, with Rabbi Yeshua ben Kochai, who ruled, we did this, Gavin and Sanhedrin, in the 30th daf, that even if two witnesses to an incident don't come before the court together, but give their testimonies on separate dates, because what happens is the first witness might come, and then word might get around town that, in fact, they're looking for another witness, and another witness comes on another day. We actually combine their separate testimonies, and their testimony is vested with the force of two witnesses, according to Rashi. So the Mishnah's ruling that the thief is exempt only when one witness testifies to the slaughter or sale applies only as long as no other witnesses appear before the court. But when another witness does subsequently appear before the court and testify to the slaughter or sale, his testimony is combined with the testimony of the first witness, and the combined testimony renders the thief liable to the fourfold or fivefold penalty. So it's not as if there's one witness and it gets thrown out of court. It's just you cannot do anything with one witness, but it's not dismissed before the court. Does that make sense? It's a very important principle to know. So what does that have to do with the fact by one's own admission? It's so in the case where the slaughter or sale is established by the thief's own admission. When the witnesses subsequently come and testify about the slaughter or sale, he becomes liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. So what we actually are saying here is, although at the time that he confesses to the slaughter, he didn't become liable, for one who admits to a fine is not liable, it's only under limited circumstances. In other words, as long as witnesses don't testify to the fine, he's fine. But in the event that witnesses do subsequently appear and attest to the fine, he's indeed liable to the fine. Okay. So you say, well, then what's the whole point of this if it doesn't protect him? So we're going to learn that there is an opinion that states, well, you might be able to get out of the fine completely. There's two different opinions. You get out of the fine completely, or you don't get out of the fine, but you get out of the penalty aspect and not the principle. Does that make sense? But I understand that need, that you can't get off completely, because then you can do the most atrocious things. I think one of the reasons that the penalties come in is because the court system becomes full. Then you're actually troubling the people to give testimony, etc. When in fact the whole point here is to make sure there's financial restitution to those who are aggrieved, and to actually pay as little damages as possible to yourself. Don't damage yourself and cover out with other people. So I, in my humble opinion, and it is very ignorant, is that I would agree that, in my own personal opinion, there would have to be some sort of principal paid. Otherwise, it would just get you off. And the whole point is the penalty is to try and sting you into doing the right thing. Okay. So, but again, we're going to learn, as Gavin and I have said before, Kevin, is that sometimes it's great to stretch yourself to see another point of view. That's the whole point of Gemara, because we naturally gravitate towards our own points of view. So what we're saying is, so in the case where the slaughter or sale was established by the thief's own admission, when witnesses subsequently come and testify about the slaughter or sale, he is liable to the four- or fivefold payment, which means it doesn't exonerate him at the point that witnesses come. So this serves to exclude that which Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. For Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, if one admits to being liable to a fine, and witnesses then come and testify to his guilt, he's not liable to pay the fine. In other words, according to Rav, one does not pay a fine by his own admission. And Rav even carries this a step further and maintains that not only admitting a fine does not make him liable to payment, but it even absolves him from the fine completely. That is, if witnesses come later and attest his guilt, he's not liable to the fine. Our Mishnah, by stating the law of one witness together with the law of one's own admission, contradicts Rav's ruling in this matter, because the thief's prior admission to the fine doesn't compromise the future effectiveness of the testimony in this matter. Rather, if witnesses come later and testify to the fine, he becomes liable to pay it. Okay. So now,
even if he's admitted to it.
Because we're going to learn later. Well, there's a discussion that maybe if you at least pay the penalty, it means you were really acting in good faith to pay something. But if you're not going to pay anything, then you're just trying to get out of trouble. So what's the point of that? Anybody can just go and get out of trouble. There's different opinions, but that's the opinion that makes the most sense to me, which is going to unravel in the Gemara. But we're going to go through it. Gav, just let it unfold a little bit. Okay. So the Gemara digresses to discuss the ruling just started. The text itself states, Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, if one admits to being liable to a fine and witnesses then come and testify to his guilt, he's not liable to pay the fine. That's Rav's view. He's the most lenient. So the Gemara challenges this ruling. Rav Chisda challenged Rav Huna from the following brisa. There was an incident involving Rabban Gamliel, who blinded the eye of Tavi, his slave, and was rejoicing greatly. So before you find out that he was rejoicing at causing somebody else pain, this is not Rabbi Shimon, Rabban Gamliel's sort of nature. So there must have been a reason. Why was he rejoicing when he blinded the eye of his slave? Because there was a commentary in Gemara Sukkah on the 20th daf and Brochas in the Mishnah in 16b that obviously Rabban Gamliel was a righteous man, and Tavi the slave, obviously Rabban Gamliel wanted to actually emancipate him. He wanted to free him because he was prevented from doing so from the Torah admission regarding Canaanite slaves, which says in Gittin, in the 38th daf, you shall subjugate them forever. Thus he rejoiced when he blinded Tavi's eyes, for now Tavi would be a free man. So apparently this Tavi was obviously a very exceptional individual, and obviously Rabban Gamliel wanted to free him. So we don't know much about this slave, but there must have been something very special about him. Now, before you say why should we subjugate them, you're dealing with ISIS, but the Canaanites were like ISIS. They weren't exactly your garden variety human being. So, nobody would cry bitter tears for them if you knew their nature. So that's number one. Now, I had a question on Rabban Gamliel. If you could damage the person you want to free, if you could damage his eye or his tooth, is it not better to damage his tooth? Because if you like this person, why make him lose an eye to get him free? Why not just hit him in the mouth and lose a tooth? Why damage him more severely? Guys, you understand what I'm saying?
No, 100%.
So my answer to my question could only be is that he never damaged him on purpose. There was an accident that happened, and within this accident, he figured he might as well take this opportunity and free his slave, at which he was not obligated to free and wasn't allowed to, unless the circumstances came up, and he was rather joyous about it, because in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 46, is the one that the Gittin is based on, that you shall subjugate a Canaanite slave forever. That's exactly where it came from. So let's assume that he obviously did it by accident, and he was now rejoicing at the fact that a very good person, which was an exception, could be released. But Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, okay, so they brought this brisa. Rav Chisda challenged Rav Huna from this brisa. So there was an incident involving Rabban Gamliel, who blinded the eye of Tavi, his slave, and he was rejoicing greatly at the opportunity of freeing him. So he found Rav Yoshua and said to him, do you not know that my slave Tavi went free? Rav Yoshua said to him, why? Rabban Gamliel said to him, because I blinded his eye. Rav Yoshua said to him, there's nothing of substance in your words, for he has no witnesses. Implying, and you do not become liable to a fine by your own admission. Hence, since the obligation to free a slave for blinding his eye is only a fine, there are no witnesses attesting to the incident, he cannot be free. So why is this principle coming up? Is that Rashba deduces from this that one who admits to a fine is not liable to pay at all, even as a non-enforceable obligation, Gavin. Because what are we talking about a non-enforceable obligation? There's a difference between an obligation that the courts can enforce you to do it, and a non-enforceable obligation, which means the court can't force you to do it. But you've got an obligation to heaven in certain cases, not to the earthly court, which means you could, Rabban Gamliel could still have free tavi based on his obligation to heaven. So here there's not even a heaven ordinance to obligate him. So therefore, if you admit to a fine, there's not only no earthly obligation to pay that fine, but there's no heavenly obligation in this case either. So this seems to be a proof that if you admit to a fine from your own admission, there's no liability whatsoever. That's the proof that's brought here by Rav Huna to come to Rav's defense. Okay?
But you're still liable for the principle, Damon. Sorry, because you brought it up earlier. I just want to clarify something. You're not liable to the fines, but you're still liable for the principle on your own.
No, there's opinions that say not at all. That's what
I heard you saying. So I'm right. No, I heard you say that. Okay, so you are saying
that's correct. What I'm saying is I personally gravitate towards where there's at least a principle paid. Otherwise, it seems like it's open to abuse.
Yeah, I'll go steal every single day and just keep admitting to it.
Yeah, so let's just hear this with an open mind for the next day or two, and then once everything unfolds, we're going to do it. So all we are saying here is we're looking at the extremes, okay? So basically, Rav Yeshua said, get to Rabban ben Gamliel, there's nothing of substance in your words, for there's no witnesses, meaning your own testimony can't obligate you to pay, your own confession. Now, Rav Yeshua's reply implies, but if he did have witnesses who would come and testify to the incident, Rabban Gamliel would be liable to free him, even though Rabban Gamliel has already admitted to inflicting the injury before the witnesses in court. And we learn from this brisa that if one admits to being liable to a fine, and witnesses then come and testify to his guilt, he is liable to the fine. So what we are learning here is that the obligation doesn't free you if witnesses come. It only frees you from any payment until witnesses come, which means you cannot incriminate yourself, Gavin. That's what this principle is coming to teach. That's all it's coming to teach. That's all. So that's an interesting slant on it. Okay, so let me just finish further. So Rav Huna deflects the challenge. Rav Huna said to him, generally one who admits to fine is exempt even if witnesses come later and testify to the fine. Because Rav Huna is on Rav's side. That says you never end up paying the fine. So he says the case involving Rabban Gamliel is different because he didn't admit to the fine in front of the court. In other words, his admission didn't exempt him. It wasn't a proper legal proceeding because if witnesses would come, he would be liable. However, when one admits to a fine in court, he is absolved from the fine and does not pay even if witnesses come later. So Rav Huna is basically saying is that if there was a proper court admission, there would be no fine even if witnesses come later. The court would exonerate him. That's Rav Huna's interpretation of this. And he's saying the reason why there wasn't a problem is the two of them were talking outside the courtroom. Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi. So Rav Huna is basically saying, like Rav, if it was admitted before the court, even if witnesses came later, that person is exonerated. Whereas it's different. It's different to the opinion of Rav Chisda, who said, look, it's not the case. We're learning from this price, if one admits to being liable to a fine, you're off the hook because you can't incriminate yourself. But the minute witnesses come and testify to the guilt, you're liable to the fine. Obviously, Rav Huna says the opposite. The Gemara counters why he most certainly did admit before the court, as Rav Yeshua was president of the court, which means it's arguing with Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said, listen, this matter didn't happen officially by the court. So his admission did not exempt him. If witnesses would come, he'd be liable, whereas when one admits to a fine in court, he's absolved from the fine and he doesn't pay it even if witnesses come later. That was Rav Huna. The Gemara counters and said it's not true. This was done before the court, and if witnesses come later, he is incriminated. So again, the answer is Rav Yeshua was standing outside court at the time. So in other words, when Rabban Gamliel related to Rav Yeshua that he had blinded Tava's eye, the court wasn't in session and Rav Yehuda was not in the courthouse. He met him in the street, and it was there that he made the confession. Thus, his confession didn't constitute an admission before the court that would exempt him from the fine in the event that witnesses would come forth later. Okay? So, let's just see how long we've got. We've got 3 minutes. So, guys, we've got just two opinions. We're going to clarify this. Rav Huna is saying, according to Rav, it doesn't matter whether, if it occurs in court, you don't only obligate, you're not obligated to pay the fine by your own admission, nor can witnesses accuse you later because you've been indemnified by your own admission. Rav Chester doesn't agree with Rav Huna and says no. If it's admitted before the court, you can't incriminate yourself, but if witnesses come later, you do pay the fine. That's the bottom line. All right, guys, I don't want to use the last 2 minutes. We started with Kevin teaching us, and we've done 40 minutes. I'm happy to finish.
Just one question, Damon, on the if there was only one witness to the theft, usually it's got to be two witnesses.
Correct.
So did you say that even though it's one witness, that his evidence he's still taken seriously, even though it's not dismissed, it's dismissed completely?
It's dismissed.
It has to be two witnesses.
One witness. That's not a chiddush, Kevin. We've always learned that one witness can't obligate somebody to pay or get any sort of criminal act against them, whether it's a death penalty, lashes, or financial penalty. One witness doesn't hold water. What we're saying here is something different. That's not the chiddush. The Gemara is saying, the Mishnah is teaching us that establishing the slaughter or sale of the stolen animal by your own admission is as comparable as establishing it by the testimony of one witness. Just as in the case where the slaughter or sale is established by one witness, when another witness subsequently comes and joins them, the thief becomes liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. So too in the case where the slaughter or sale is established by one's own admission, it doesn't exonerate you from paying. It just means you can't incriminate yourself. And when witnesses subsequently come and testify about the slaughter or sale, he becomes liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. So they're saying we learn the two to teach you that if one witness is joined by another, even in separate testimonies, that can incriminate this defendant. So too, if somebody admits to the fine and witnesses come later, the defendant is incriminated. That's all it's saying. One witness alone doesn't have any strength. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful, guys. Have a wonderful evening. I'm quite happy to finish, and I'm quite happy to teach you. Have a great night. I hope today was good. We covered a lot of ground. Actually, a lot of ground.
No, you're right, but it was clear to me. I don't know how it was for everyone.
And you can give the summary tomorrow night, Gavin. Give Damon a break. You can do it. Now you